Welcome to Unintended Consequences, Episode 28, for June 11th, 2026. Today's story is one of those rare examples where the cure was almost worse than the disease, at least at first. On the morning of March 13th, 2016, emergency rooms in Michigan recorded a 24% jump in heart attack admissions compared with the previous Monday. That single-day spike stood out because nothing else in the surrounding calendar had changed. No holiday, no weather event, no shift in medical staffing. The only alteration in the preceding 24 hours had been the 1 hour advance of the clocks for daylight saving time. Researchers later traced the same pattern in other years and other states, confirming that the jump was not an isolated anomaly. The policy itself had been sold, first in 1916 and again in 1974, as a way to stretch scarce fuel supplies by moving an hour of daylight into the evening. The underlying arithmetic seemed straightforward at the time. If households and factories needed less artificial light after sunset, then the fuel that would have been burned for lamps or bulbs could be redirected elsewhere. Instead, the same 1 hour shift now reliably produced measurable increases in myocardial infarctions, fatal traffic accidents, and workplace injuries once the data were examined decades later. The first nationwide adoption occurred in Germany and Austria-Hungary on 30 April 1916. The Imperial German government faced an Allied blockade that had cut off overseas coal and food, leaving domestic reserves under intense pressure. Every ton of fuel burned for lighting was therefore a ton unavailable for the war economy, specifically for the blast furnaces that produced steel or the locomotives that moved troops and supplies. Officials calculated that shifting clocks forward 1 hour would reduce evening demand for artificial light, and thereby free coal for the steel mills and railroads, an assumption grounded in the simple observation that most lighting loads occurred after sunset. The same logic reappeared in the United States during the 1973 oil embargo. President Nixon asked Congress for emergency authority to extend daylight saving time year-round, arguing that an extra hour of evening daylight would cut national petroleum consumption by roughly 1%. Lawmakers, facing gas lines and rationing plans, passed the Emergency Daylight Saving Time Energy Conservation Act in December 1973, with broad bipartisan support because the projected saving, though modest, looked achievable without new infrastructure. Germany's 1916 decree took effect in a single night. Clocks advanced at 11 p.m. on 30 April, and the change was presented as a patriotic duty that every household could perform by moving the hands on its own timepieces. The United States followed in March 1918 under the Standard Time Act, though the measure was repealed after the armistice once the wartime pressure eased. During the 1973 crisis, the new federal rule began on 6 January 1974, and was scheduled to last until the end of the embargo, relying on the precedent that British gaslighting loads had fallen measurably during both world wars when clocks were advanced. Skeptics in Congress, including Senator Bob Dole, warned that children would be walking to school in darkness and that the energy savings might prove illusory once heating and cooling patterns were considered. One might ask whether the extra evening light would simply offset any morning losses. Yet the objection centered on the fact that heating systems often run on different schedules than lighting, and that air conditioning demand could rise in the newly lit evening hours. Large-scale studies later quantified the health effects. A 2008 Swedish registry study of more than 1.5 million heart attack cases found a 5% increase in incidence during the first week after the spring transition. Similar spikes appeared in Michigan and Texas datasets, each showing the same directional rise even though the absolute numbers varied with local population size. The causal pathway runs through sleep deprivation. The body's circadian clock advances more slowly than the calendar, producing an average loss of 40 to 60 minutes of sleep on the night of the change. That 40 to 60 minute deficit is not spread evenly. It concentrates among people whose internal rhythms are already near the threshold of vulnerability, raising blood pressure and inflammatory markers and thereby elevating cardiac risk for those already susceptible. Traffic data show a parallel pattern. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration recorded a 6 to 7% rise in fatal crashes on the Monday after spring forward in states that observed the shift. One could object that drivers might adapt quickly, yet the data indicate the combined effect of darker morning commutes and reduced alertness persists long enough to register in the crash statistics for that single day. Energy savings proved negligible. A 2008 Department of Energy report on the 2007 extension of daylight saving time found a 0.03% reduction in electricity use. That figure was statistically indistinguishable from zero once air conditioning loads in the evening were counted, because the extra hour of daylight pushed cooling demand higher in regions where temperatures remained elevated after sunset. In warm climates, the extra hour of evening light increased cooling demand more than it reduced lighting demand, reversing the original wartime assumption that lighting reductions would dominate. By the 2010s, a growing number of jurisdictions began reversing course. Russia abandoned the practice in 2014 after 3 years of year-round daylight saving time produced widespread complaints of winter darkness in the morning. The European Parliament voted in 2019 to end seasonal clock changes by 2021, though implementation stalled among member states as each weighed its own latitude and commuting patterns. In the United States, Arizona, except the Navajo Nation, and Hawaii have never observed daylight saving time, while Florida and several other states have passed laws to remain on daylight time permanently if Congress permits. No large jurisdiction has reported new problems from staying on standard time year-round. Complex physiological and behavioral systems often absorb a simple schedule change by shifting risk rather than eliminating cost. When an intervention is justified solely by an assumed first-order resource saving, any second-order effects on sleep, commuting, or temperature control can erase the intended benefit. Because the original wartime justification no longer applies, the policy now persists largely through institutional inertia. The practical question for any proposed clock change is therefore whether the measurable health and safety externalities have been priced into the decision at all. Consider a modern proposal to adjust school start times for energy savings. What second-order effects on sleep and safety would you examine before supporting the change? That's unintended consequences for today. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with a friend who'd appreciate the story. Subscribe wherever you listen, and we'll be back tomorrow with another case. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts covering tech, science, markets, and more. If you enjoyed today's episode, give Fascinating Frontiers a listen. The most fascinating news from space and science. You can explore the whole lineup at naranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.